Hello, and welcome back to our third live broadcast as part of Thinking Like a Geographer, an AP Human Geography MOOC. I'm Mr. C. I'm back once again. Just wanted to say hello to all of you that are watching, and those of you who are watching recordings, we'll watch the recordings later. Thank you for joining us. Also want to remind you to keep those questions coming in to the MOOC, to the blog page. Continuing to comment on the forum and things like that. So just kind of want to remind you of those things. So did not have as many questions this week, just one question this week. It is from Christina. Oh, wait a minute. I have another question from Dylan. Different types of boundary disputes. Okay, so let's talk about two questions that came up. One is what kind of models do we need to know from the politics unit? Well, I have good news and possibly bad news. If you like models, it's probably a good, or it's probably bad news if you like models. If you don't like models, then it's probably good news. Basically, there's not a lot of models, and there's quite a few theories, and we'll talk about those tonight. But for the most part, the only model that you probably want to know is what's called Ratzel's organic state model. And, you know, it's not necessarily something that is always on the test or it plays a prominent role in this, at least from my experience in either the multiple choice or the short answer FRQ questions. However, it is something that you will want to look at. And basically, Ratzel's organic state model is kind of more about comparing a state and the evolution and growth and development of a state in terms of politically and territorially to that of a biological organism. And that is, we tend to think of states in their mature state, in their mature phase, when in actuality, states are not born in their mature phase. They must grow and develop into that. And so Ratzel basically outlines 7 or 8 different stages that kind of talk about that development. So, and basically, this to put it in a nutshell, in some basic frames in terms of Ratzel, is this idea that a state starts off with the growth in population of a similar population base to create a kind of a homogeneous community, and then it begins to expand its borders out as space is needed. And as it is expanding out, it will kind of envelop or assimilate other entities into it. So, you know, tribes and things like that, smaller countries, other territories that might be nearby. It's going to kind of absorb those and make them part of its own system. It will continue to grow. You'll see a frontier develop or an edge of territory that is harder to control and less under control than some other particular areas. And you know, this process continues and continues and continues. So you could compare it to the United States, for example. If you looked at the United States, if you go back to your U.S. history, which, you know, for us around here is 8th grade, you could talk about the colonization period as kind of that building and the homogenization factor of Western European immigration. You could talk about the 13 colonies being kind of that first kind of increase in terms of space. You could talk about the Indian removal or the Trail of Tears. You could talk about the Northwest Territories. You could talk about the conflicts with the French and the British as ways that territory was expanded. You could talk about the Louisiana Purchase. Then you could talk about all of those as being kind of the evolution and growth of the state model in terms of maybe what some of the things that Ratzel is talking about. And then adding to that the idea of the frontier, which would be, you know, the Old West and some of those kinds of things. So if you go back and look at that model, it should be in your text. If not, you could probably Google it. You know, Ratzel's R-A-T-Z-E-L, Ratzel's organic state model, and just kind of look at those different stages and kind of go from there. So that's something just kind of to keep in mind. Okay, so that's the only model that you'll really want to know. But we'll move on to some more details about some of the things in this chapter or in this unit a little later. There is one other question that I want to address, and it looks like this one came in kind of right here before we got started, and so did not have a lot of time to necessarily prep for this one. So I'm going to answer this as best I can. I'm not exactly sure what Dylan means by this question, but Dylan has asked, hello Dylan, can you explain the different types of boundary disputes? Well, one of the things that I want to kind of discuss a little bit, I guess, is the idea of boundaries. And that's one thing that you'll really want to know moving into the test is how boundaries are created over time and how times change. And the one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the idea of political boundaries as we know them today is a relatively new concept. All right? The idea of this is the area that is marked off that belongs to this state or this group of people is relatively new. Throughout most of human history, boundaries were kind of loosely defined. They were vague. They were harder to define, and so there's this idea of this is mine and that's yours is not as easy historically. So one of the things to remember is that lots of different boundary types developed as modern nations and modern states began to kind of demarcate territory and demarcate where their stuff ended and where someone else's began. But a lot of times these demarcations were done in ways that did not necessarily account for previous human settlement patterns or things like that. So there is a long list of different types of boundaries, and I will not get into many of them today, but I will kind of describe some different types of boundaries and kind of how those different things, how those different disputes can arise over some of those. And hopefully, Dylan, that will answer your question. So, for example, remember that boundaries really are divisions between groups of people in a modern sense, but that those divisions may not have always existed. So, for example, if we look at something like Africa, divisions within Africa, political boundaries, as we know them today, most of them were created in the latter half of the 20th century as European countries left. As imperialism winded down and ended, you had those leaving European powers kind of drawing boundaries within the territory that they owned. The problem was that a lot of those boundaries did not take into account the people that lived there. So, for example, I have seen some images or estimates that if you were to draw boundaries around each ethnic group or culture group or language group within Africa, there'd be something like 8,000 countries or 8,000 states within Africa. So that's all, or maybe it was 800. 800 sounds more like it. I apologize, I exaggerated there a little bit. And so a lot of times when the Europeans were leaving, especially places like Africa, they would draw lines arbitrarily without taking into account where these groups had traditionally lived. So what resources did these groups traditionally control? What was their traditional values and ideas and power structures? And they didn't take those into account. So a lot of times these groups were kind of forced together. And so there's a lot of times boundary disputes will occur within states as these different groups are trying to identify themselves. Between states, a lot of times boundary disputes happen for multiple different reasons. So they usually have something to do with the one group wanting to acquire territory and one group wanting to not surrender territory. It can happen for a number of reasons. For example, this boundary runs on the wrong side of a natural resource that I want. So there may be a dispute. I want the access to this resource. I don't have it, so I'm going to dispute the boundary and try to get my hands on that. You may have a situation, what we call irredentism, which is a group of your people, your your folk, people that you are associated with or are culturally and ethnically like, may live on the other side of a border. And so there may be a dispute in terms of trying to get that border redrawn. This is very similar to what's happening in Ukraine right now. It's a very common thing in areas like Kashmir and on the India-Pakistan border. It is something similar to what Germany did with states like Yugoslavia in the late 1930s as the Third Reich began to expand their territory. They often use some of these irredentist ideas. So those people are like us, they should be with us, so we're going to dispute this boundary. Sometimes boundary disputes occur when, for example, they are based on a physical feature, and that physical feature changes. So we might, for example, draw a boundary down the middle of a river. And we did that very fairly. I have half the river, you have half the river, we both have access to it. What happens if over time that river shifts and that river changes its course or becomes diverted for some reason? This can create a huge issue in terms of borders, because now I may gain or lose territory depending on what that river does, and I may gain or lose access to that fresh water and transportation route based on what those things based on what it does. A lot of times border disputes arise because of something new that's been found, new claimed territory, and who claims it, who doesn't get it. It's something that happened a lot during the age of colonization. Spain and Portugal both claiming things, and the Pope having to step in and kind of mediate that situation between two predominantly Catholic countries. One of the things to remember, though, is that border disputes usually happen when there's something of strategic importance. Strategic meaning I control of this thing or place gives me an advantage over my neighbors or advantage over others. You don't usually have disputes over borders that are meaningless or that don't provide you with an advantage by controlling them. So keep some of those things in mind. So when you're looking at a border dispute, the question is what's there and why do they want it? Why is this an issue? And then there is also border disputes that arise because a border has been drawn in ways that maybe don't account for some kind of historical or cultural thing. So, this line's been drawn, and that's traditionally been my territory. Now I don't have it. I have a lot of cultural and connection to that place, and that sense of place is very strong, and therefore we're going to create. There's going to be a dispute over that. Border disputes are actually much less common today than they used to be. Most of those things are settled in terms of where things happen and where things go. Sometimes when states break apart, there's going to be some issues with where to draw those borders. Most of those things are settled fairly peacefully and fairly amicably, at least today. There are some examples of that, but usually when those things change, it's because there's a new resource that's been discovered. There's a new need to get from point A to point B in a different way, and those are where a lot of those disputes kind of come from. So I didn't. I hope I addressed your question, Dylan, just kind of in general about what causes these kind of disputes and why they happen. Most of the time, like I said today, they're settled relatively peacefully. For example, the situation in Ukraine to this point has been relatively peaceful in terms of there hasn't been a lot of military violence involved, even though there was the threat of that, but that it hasn't happened yet. So anyway, so hopefully that answers your question, Dylan, and I appreciate you asking that. And if not, go ahead and log into the forum and put it there, and I'll see if I can address it better to your liking sometime in the next week or so. Okay, so those are the two questions that were presented. Thank you again, Christina, for being our home run hitter on questions. Once again, you had 3 last week and 1 this week. We appreciate you asking those. Dylan, we also appreciate your contribution today. All right, let me kind of just review some concepts about politics. This is a very interesting unit. It's one that I'm personally very fascinated with. The problem with this unit is that it's very, very abstract. It's very it deals with some things that are hard to see visually. So when we talk about trying to relate these things to, spatial relationships, it can be a little harder because really we're talking about kind of a blending of culture, a blending of different population and movement, and all these kinds of things kind of play a role here, and it becomes at times very difficult to understand. It's also very difficult for us to understand here in the United States. Um, you may or may not have seen the cartoon, and there's several different versions of it floating around the internet. Some are, more appropriate than others, where it kind of talks about the American worldview or how America views the rest of the world, and it's, got like, kangaroos in Australia and sand in North Africa, and just this very very simplistic, overly simplistic view of the world, and that's always been a criticism of modern Americans, is that we have a very simplistic view of the rest of the world, which is unfortunate, but it's at the same time it is fortunate in that part of the reason why we have this narrow, overly simplistic view of the world is that we are kind of isolated from the rest of the world. We have large oceans on either side. We have had relatively good relationships with our neighbors, in terms of Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean, and we kind of don't have a lot of problems or issues with South America, and with the exception of kind of the way we dealt with Native Americans and some border disputes with Mexico. Most of our existence in terms of relating to our neighbors has been very peaceful and very quiet, and basically controlled by us. So we don't have a problem with those outcomes. The rest of the world, however, has a far different way of looking at this idea of politics and geography and how they interact, because the rest of the world is much closer together. Most countries are much smaller. They border many more countries than we do. 4, 5, 6 countries that you may border, as opposed to just the 2 that we border. And because they're not separated by oceans, many of them are just separated by maybe a river, if you're lucky, maybe a mountain range. But the idea of what your neighbor does affects you is a big concern in other parts of the world where it's not as big a deal here. What happens in France affects Britain and Spain and Italy and Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany and all kinds of countries in Western Europe, because they're so close together, because they share boundaries, because they share resources, because they share geographical features. You can't simply overlook what your neighbor does. Because you have many neighbors, you need to know what they're doing at all times. And so the rest of the world has spent for generations, has kind of lived with this idea that they need to be very careful and cautious of what their neighbors are doing. And so when we talk about politics within this context, we have a very different lens to look through, as opposed to what we as Americans do. We look at Canada and we see hockey and snow. We look at Mexico and we see cheap products and tacos or whatever. But if you live in one of these places where there's lots of countries, then you really have to have a deeper understanding of what's going on the other side of that fence, or the other side of that wall, or the other side of that white line on the sand. And that's kind of where I wanted to go today, was to kind of talk about how some of these things affect the way that we look at the world. So before we get too much further into politics, I want to talk a little bit about ethnicity. Ethnicity is one of these topics that's in human geography, but we don't always know where to put it, because it can go several different places. So ethnicity, and it sometimes goes with culture. Sometimes I've traditionally put it with politics, because of the idea of ethnic nationalism, which we'll talk about in a second, and how important that particular piece is. So just a little bit about ethnicity. Ethnicity tends to be kind of difficult to define. Basically, ethnicity talks about what group do you identify with, and why do you identify with them. So, for example, Do you identify with groups historically, culturally because of your religion? Do you identify with groups historically, culturally because of your nation of origin? Do you do it because of any number of factors? So think about your school cafeteria. Why do you sit with the kids that you sit with? What are the reasons for that? Now take that and multiply that by hundreds of years of common shared identity, common shared history, common shared ideas, and you begin to see these ethnicities, ethnic identities begin to establish themselves and develop. When we talk about ethnicity, the other kind of term that comes to mind is a word that we in the U.S. misuse more than probably any other word in the realm of politics, which is the idea of nation. So nation, we tend to use synonymously with country, and that is not the proper way to use that term. And we want to make sure we know this because it's a very important concept in the politics unit. So, for example, nation does not refer to a political system with boundaries and territory. A nation refers to a group of people. Let me say that again. Nation refers to a group of people. And those people identify themselves with each other based on some common history, ideas, values, whatever it might be. Okay, and so because of that, they have a sense of unity, a sense of commonality, a sense of kinship that develops, even though they might not actually be blood related. One of the places where we really see ethnicity come into play is when we start talking about international immigration. For example, especially prior to in the 19th century, especially, and a lot of the 20th century as well, you could go to big metropolitan areas, especially places like Los Angeles or Seattle, New York or Boston, and you would see neighborhoods that were defined by a particular ethnic group, people that came from the same place, migrated or immigrated there. And part of the reason why this occurred historically was that as immigrants would come into a new place, they would look for people like them. They would look for people who spoke their language, people who looked like them, people who wore the clothes they wore, ate the food they did, for a couple of reasons. One, they tended to feel more at ease and safer when they were around people that they knew. They could communicate with them, and those people that they knew would often help them in terms of navigating this new system, this new country, this new culture. And so the bonds between these groups often became very, very strong. So we can look at this in terms of Irish immigrants in the 19th century, for example, or a lot of Asian immigrants as they come in now, kind of tend to gravitate to areas that have people like them. And this is true of all kinds of different groups. So I've only listed a few. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's perfectly natural for human beings to want to be and gravitate to people like them, especially in times of uncertainty, in times of instability, in times of confusion, in times of crisis. We tend to want to simplify things and stick with those people. But if we take this idea and this idea of ethnicity and group identity, and that's another thing that we want to associate with ethnicity is group identity, not individual identity, but group. What group of people do I identify with? What group is like me, and how do we get together and get along? If you take that idea and you multiply that over many, many years and many, many people, you begin to develop this idea of a nation, which is a large group of people who have these similar experiences, similar culture, similar history, things like that. And so really it's about the idea of people groups. And politics in general, I would argue, is about it is about people groups and groups of people, and who do we identify with, who do we not identify with, all kinds of things like that. Okay, all right. When I do politics, I look at Europe. That's the region that I look at. Some of the same rules apply other places, but they apply specifically to Europe in some very, very tangible ways. So throughout history, Europeans have lived very close together, and there's been lots of different groups that have come in and out of Europe. Of course, we could go back to the fall of the Roman Empire and the Germanic invasions of people from Central Asia. We can talk about the Vikings. We can talk about the spread of Islam into the Iberian Peninsula and into Eastern Europe. At any rate, Europe has been this kind of crossroads region where there's been lots of cultural blending. So over time, lots of these individual people groups, these people groups that identify themselves ethnically as unique from the other groups around them, developed. What this kind of led to, partially, was over the course of 1,000 years or so, or 1,500 years, was a kind of a constant conflict within these groups, these constantly fighting each other, either because they didn't like each other or because they were trying to gain advantage over each other. So whether we're talking about the 100 Years' War, which was really about who the French or the British who really ethnically should control England. If we're looking at the 30 Years' War, which was between Protestants and Catholics, and who would control, whether we're looking at all kinds of different conflicts in the 17th and 18th century, but all this kind of conflict and nationalism and people groups fighting each other was very, very common in in Europe, all the way up until World War I. So World War I starts in 1914, and it is kind of the culmination of these nationalistic groups fighting each other. So you've got France, and you've got Britain, and you've got Germany, and you've got Austria, and Austria is composed of dozens of ethnic groups. You've got Italy, you've got the Ottoman Empire, you've got Russia. You have all these countries who are identifying themselves as uniquely different from other groups. And not only are they uniquely different, but they have a sense of cultural superiority. So not only are we awesome, we are the awesomest. Okay? And we have to prove that. So World War I is really about these countries that think they're awesome trying to prove to each other how awesome they are. The problem is that we're not fighting with sticks anymore. We're not fighting with rocks. We're not fighting with primitive weapons and swords and primitive guns. We're fighting with industrialized weapons that do an incredible amount of destruction, and literally millions of people are killed, all in the name of proving that your ethnic group is better than everybody else. And so that really comes to a head in the 20th century in World War I and World War II. So keeping in mind this idea that Europe is heavily divided along ethnic lines and identity lines, there's a couple more kind of terminology that we really want to be familiar with. And once again, vocabulary, study your vocabulary. Okay. So the other idea is one that we also get confused, which is state. And state is an autonomous entity, and I want to make sure you understand what that word autonomous means. Autonomous means that there's no other authority above you. No one else can tell you what to do. So if I want to do something, and I have to make sure my wife is okay with it. I have to make sure that the police in my town are okay with it, that the state that I live in is okay with it, the country that I live in. I don't have autonomy. All right, I have limitations on what I can do. However, we live in the United States. If the United States wants to do something, it can, because there's really no one telling them they can't do something. This is true with Mexico. This is true with Canada. This is true with Zimbabwe. Any place that has the ability to act without a higher authority putting limitations on their actions is a state, and we want to make sure that we're very clear on that. So nations and states. When we have a situation where nations and states occupy the same space and the same boundaries, we call it a nation-state. Very complicated term there. However, nation-states are very, very rare, and that states usually have many different groups living within them. And this is where areas like Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa and Southwest Asia become very problematic, because you have all of these different groups living inside the same political boundaries. So within the boundaries of a state, you may have lots of different groups of people. The question becomes, which group of people gets to have the most power, which group of people gets to make decisions on behalf of the government, which group of people gets to influence what goes on. In some places, this is not a big deal. In some places, the people making decisions are fair and equitable, and no one has a problem with it. In some places, they're fair and equitable, but still nobody likes those decisions. Some places, they're not fair and equitable. So the question becomes then, how are these decisions made? Especially in these multinational states, and that's an important term. Multinational state means a state with multiple nations or many people groups living within it. How do we do that? Okay, so for example, there are some examples like Belgium. Belgium has decided over time to go with a divided government where they share power relatively equally between the two major groups, the Flemings and the Walloons, and all is fine. They get along. Well, not always great, but it's not that big a deal. Okay, then you have situations like in the early 1990s when Czechoslovakia broke away from the Soviet Union and got rid of communism. There was a strong push within the country to see the two very distinct groups of people that lived in Czechoslovakia really wanted to be independent. So the Czechs, who lived in predominantly the western half of the country, and the Slovaks, who lived predominantly in the eastern half, decided mutually to go ahead and split apart and create their own countries. And this was not a big deal, though it went along fairly swimmingly to break these things apart. These are kind of the exceptions to the rule, especially in Europe. When these things happen, when these kind of fracturings happen, when these things break apart, a lot of times it's a lot messier because the lines between groups is not always nice and neat. So the lines between the territory where one group lives, another group lives, is often blended and mixed together, and it becomes very difficult to kind of divide that up. This is the situation that happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, from 1994 to about 2000, 2001, before it finally kind of resolved itself. Was that you had lots of different groups living inside the same boundaries, and over time, more and more of these groups wanted to break away and create their own place where they would have autonomy. Croats wanted to have a Croat state where the Croats had the power. The Slovenes wanted a Slovene state where they had the power. Bosnians wanted a Bosnian state. The problem is that in most of these cases, not Slovenia, but in the other cases, there was lots of blending going on there, and a lot of the blending occurred when you had areas that were occupied by Croats and Bosnians, and the dominant group in Yugoslavia were the Serbs, who lived in the eastern half of the country. The Serbs had traditionally been kind of the power group, especially under communist rule of Tito. So when the country starts to break apart, the Serbs see this as they're going to lose a lot of power. They're going to lose a lot of territory. They're going to lose a lot of resources, and they're going to have problems because their people are now going to be spread apart across 5, 6, 7 different little states. And so this leads to an incredible amount of violence and bloodshed in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, all because we have these different divisions. And this happens in a lot of different places. If we go to Iran, we would see the same thing. If we go to Syria, the issues in Syria recently have been very much driven by some of these same kind of ethnic divisions within countries, or these multinational states trying to figure out how to divide power. A lot of times they split apart, and sometimes it's peaceful, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's ugly. And creates these differences. When they break apart, we call this devolution or de-evolution, which is kind of a shifting of authority and power from a centralized place to a decentralized place. Sometimes this leads to new countries. Sometimes it just means to some different power arrangements. So this idea of there's one government in one state to now there may be one government but the power being spread out, or that one country breaks up into multiple pieces, like happened in Yugoslavia. And the possibility of this happening in Europe is very, very common, mainly because of all of these ethnic groups and these ethnic identities that are created. So you can look in pretty much any country in Europe and find some group that is interested in increasing its power within a particular state. They don't all want to break away, but oftentimes they're trying to gain an advantage. When we have these groups that are nations but don't have any political power, we call them stateless nations because they do not have power over the political decision making in any particular place where they live. So there are multiple examples of these stateless nations. So some of the larger groups and more popular groups in terms of what goes on are the Kurds who live in Southwest Asia, across Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and the Palestinians who live mainly in what is now Israel, Jordan, a little bit into Egypt, a little bit into Lebanon and Syria as well. So these groups identify themselves as uniquely different and unique from the other people that they live with, but they also do not have a significant amount of political power within their state. So they are ultimately forced to live under the political power of somebody else. Like I said, in a lot of cases, ethnic groups are fine with that. They don't have a problem with that. In other places, it can get pretty ugly, as it has for many years in Israel, as the Israeli government and the Palestinian kind of stateless nation groups kind of try to gain power within that state. Same thing with the Kurds. The Kurdish nationalism rises and falls from time to time, depending on what goes on. So those are some of the bigger issues to think about in terms of the way that ethnicity and identity ties into politics, and it's a crucial link in this unit that we tie how groups identify themselves with with the political structures that are around, and how those imbalances help to create tension. So this also kind of gets back to some things that Dylan asked in his question about border disputes. Sometimes these things are involved. A couple other things to think about is we mentioned devolution, when a state kind of breaks apart or when centralized authority gets pushed away and redistributed in some way. We also have the opposite effect, which is supranationalism. And this kind of evolves after World War II. So after all of this generations of violence between European countries, after World War II kind of just destroys the continent. The leaders of Europe and the wise people of Europe, the people that survived these two horrible conflicts, started to really ask questions about, is this competition really good? Is us fighting each other and trying to promote our own nationalism and our own identity really doing us any good? Because it's really not. All we're doing is killing each other. We have to have people bail us out of our problems all the time. Our fighting allows crazy people to come to power, like the Nazis, or like the red shirts in Italy. I'm sorry, the brown shirts in Italy. We can't have this. We need to start cooperating. So one of the first things that happens is in the 1950s, we see the evolution of what's called the European Common Market, in which European countries say, we have all these borders that we share. We're so close together. We share languages in many places. We share religions in many places. We really have more in common than we have separate us. What if we began to cooperate in terms of economics? So over the course of several years, you began to see lots of free trade within Europe, between especially Western European countries, as they got rid of barriers to trade and as the movement of goods and people and services became very, very open and free. One of the byproducts of this is that these cultures, while maintaining their independence, also became more interconnected. And the more interconnected you are to someone, the less violence and the less competition actually occurs. Excuse me, let me scratch my eye real quick. My apology. And so this European Common Market grew and grew and grew until the late 90s. It turns into what we now know as the European Union. And what's interesting about the European Union is it really forces us to question our assumptions about this idea of sovereignty and autonomy. If we're going to live together and work together and be interconnected to each other, to what extent can we still claim to be individuals? To what extent can we still claim to be part of a particular smaller group. So, if I'm French or German or Austrian or Italian, and I'm part of this economic union, at some point I have to think about, is being part of the union more important than being Italian? And how do we blend those two things together? How do we make those two phenomena work together? So what we've seen is this idea of supranationalism, where countries, especially using the EU as an example, give up some of that power, give up some of that freedom, give up some of that autonomy in order to live together. So I'm going to have to open my borders and not fortify my borders. I'm going to have to, for example, adopt maybe a common passport. Maybe we're going to have to talk about European citizenship and what that means. And will we allow, are we going to have laws that apply to all Europeans within our country, as opposed to just the laws of one country or another? We see the EU adopt a common currency, except for really Britain is the only one that really hasn't adopted that to this point, and maybe Sweden. I remember, it's been a while since I looked at that map. But anyway, so we're kind of blending things together. We're uniting together. We're doing more and more things together. This begins to call into question this idea of autonomy and this idea of something more than just individual nationalism, but supranationalism. Now, European nationalism, kind of taking the sense of individuality of these individual people groups and kind of making that less important. Some people have used the term the United States of Europe to describe this. Yes and no. Obviously, they are still independent. They are still have their own identity. But in terms of that blending, that is also a nice kind of metaphor to think about, is that idea of supranationalism. Okay. So we've got a couple more things that we just kind of want to touch on before we wrap up for the day. Once again, this is a very abstract unit, so if these concepts are kind of, if you're missing them, I totally understand that. That's what the forum is for, so check in there. A couple of things to think about moving forward. Actually, I'm going to plug my computer in before it dies, so I'm going to take like 10 seconds here. All right, sorry about that. Okay, a couple more things to remember as we're talking about politics. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of gerrymandering. And this is kind of a funny little word, but gerrymandering is an interesting concept. And gerrymandering, for those of you who have taken U.S. history, is a term that kind of comes into our kind of consciousness in the 1800s. As political leaders of political parties try to manipulate boundaries and borders in order to create power for themselves. So one thing that you want to keep in mind is this idea of kind of changing borders in order to change the way the outlook of things. So, we've got this mixed group of people. Some support Group A, some support Group B. Group B decides, okay, we're going to redraw these boundaries so that more of those groups are voting for me, so that more of those groups can work with me. One interesting case study to look at in terms of gerrymandering, it's a very recent case, is the case of Martin Frost. Hello. Okay. Is the case of Martin Frost. Martin Frost is a Democrat from Texas. He was a House member of the House of Representatives, and in the 1990s, after the 1994 election, the Republican Party took control of the Texas House for the first time in a really long time. And one of the things that they did was they began to redraw some of these boundaries in order to change how votes were distributed. And let me go on record as saying that while this particular instance was the Republicans doing it, both parties do this when they can. Both parties see advantage in drawing lines these ways. So don't think that I'm taking one side over the other. Martin Frost is just a very interesting example of this. So, so what they actually ended up doing was redrawing the boundaries of Martin Frost's district so that his house was no longer in his district. It was in somebody else's. And by law, you have to run in the district that you live in. So he was forced to either not run, uh, option A, not run, option B, move someplace else, or option 3, run against the powerful Republican incumbent in that district, a man named Joe Barton. And so those were his options, and he chose to run against Joe Barton and just did horribly, did not get very many votes at all. And so at the same time, his old district was also won by a Republican, so they were able to pick up a seat in doing that. So this is just a local to me. I don't know who else watching, but local to us here in our region about how gerrymandering can kind of affect those things. Once again, getting back to that idea that this is not a one-party deal; it's everyone that does this. So keep in mind this idea of gerrymandering. So there's a couple of ways to do this. One is called packing, where lines are redrawn in order to pack as many votes or as many of your supporters into districts as possible to kind of tilt the balance. There's one called cracking, where we take districts and we draw lines so that they're broken up into smaller chunks, or at least the power blocks of the opponent are broken up into chunks so that they can't dominate as much. And then, of course, the idea of kidnapping, which was the situation with Mark Frost, where he was actually redrawn out of his district. But that idea of gerrymandering is getting back to this idea of the political organization of space. How is space organized and used? What role does power play in understanding some of those particular things? So, okay. I've only got a few more minutes, and so I just want to wrap up with a few things. So once again, some things to focus on. Getting back to the questions from earlier, go back and look up Ratzel. Spend some time looking at those different things. Also, go back and look at different types of boundaries. So there's dozens of them, and kind of look at which ones are more common, which ones are more likely to happen in terms of how they're created, which ones are more problematic, so things like relic boundaries and superimposed boundaries kind of cause a lot of problems. Those are the kind of things we see like in sub-Saharan Africa in the wake of colonialism or imperialism. So kind of keep those things in mind. Be looking, once again, at Ratzel, be looking at and trying to differentiate in your head between nation and state, and nation states, and multinational states, and multi-state nations. How do those, heterogeneously mixed entities deal with those different dynamics? How do they share power? How do they not share power? What kinds of things lead to devolution? What kinds of things lead to supranationalism? When groups start to work together, how do they decide what kind of authority and power to give up to the group in order to be part of what's going on? So, okay, that's pretty much all the time we have for today, and that's, like I said, this is kind of some abstract stuff, and it's a unit that I usually kind of flew through rather quickly when I taught it, just because there was a lot of vocabulary, but there's not a lot of models. There's not a lot of I'm sorry, I forgot about one of the theories that I wanted to talk about. So one of the things that is likely to come up at some point, either on the test or could, is two theories. We said there was only one model, but there's several theories within the politics unit. So one is by there's two theories that are kind of contrasting. One is called the Heartland theory, and one is called the Rimland theory. Heartland is by a geographer called Mackinder, and Mackinder went back and looked historically at who holds power in Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, who traditionally holds power. And he came up with the assumption that in order to establish power in Eurasia, you needed to control the heartland. So you needed to control Eastern Europe and Central Asia and the Caucasus regions and things like that. That historically, those were the areas that were key to being able to build large territorial empires in this region. So think of people like the Mongols, think of the Persians, think of the the Ottoman Turks and the Byzantines, those kind of groups being dominant world powers according to Mackinder's analysis. The other analysis is called Rimland theory, which is proposed by a guy named Spikeman. And Spikeman kind of argues the opposite. He says, well, really, those who control the Eurasian region do so by controlling the coastal areas, the areas on the edges and the periphery. And he cites as some of his examples things like the British Empire, like the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and how they were able to use naval power and access to seaports and trade to kind of build global empires that were able to control. So be familiar with those two theories, Spikeman and Mackinder, and be able to compare and contrast them a little bit, talk about where they're coming from. So I'm glad I remembered that because I was about to forget that. So, all right, so that puts us about 50 minutes, and we've covered most of the highlights. And I would encourage you to add questions for next week. Next week will be agriculture, which sounds incredibly boring, but it's actually one of my favorite units because there's a lot of interesting things going on there when we start talking about food and where it comes from and how we manage to feed 7 billion people. So we will leave that today, and we'll look forward to talking about farming next week. Thanks. Bye.